Huawei is something that's very dangerous. You look at what they've done from a security standpoint, from a military standpoint, it's very dangerous.
我们要坚定不移发展全球自由贸易和投资。
The EU has shelved its efforts to win approval for a massive investment deal with China.
Today, ladies and gentlemen, we are announcing our intention to prohibit the inclusion of Huawei and ZTE's products and services in Canada's telecommunications systems.
The Biden administration is trying to cap China's access to advanced AI chips, but that said, are these curbs too little, too late?
U.S. President Joe Biden has issued an executive order banning U.S. investment in Chinese quantum computing, advanced chips, and AI technologies, citing national security concerns.
Key question, has the U.S. failed to contain China?
Semiconductors. They're in everything we use. Phones, computers, cars, and even military systems. But behind these tiny chips is a massive global struggle. One that's shaping the world at large.
Senior U.S. officials are set to visit China this week in an effort to bolster relations amid simmering trade tensions. This is as China's Huawei Technologies is reportedly readying a new chip that will challenge NVIDIA. That's according to the Wall Street Journal, a sign that U.S. obstacles have failed to limit Chinese companies' abilities to keep pace with U.S. tech.
China's government has poured billions into developing its own chip industry, aiming to cut its reliance on the West, while the U.S. knows that losing this race isn't just bad for business, but a threat to its national security. But how exactly did China and the U.S. enter a Cold War over computer chips? This is one of the first integrated circuits, developed in the late 1950s by engineers in the United States. The original design featured a single transistor along with other components, like resistors and capacitors, on a single piece of germanium. Over the next few years, engineers including Robert Noyce began creating semiconductor chips with multiple transistors. The more transistors, the more powerful it became.
In 1965, Gordon Moore set out in a paper what became known as Moore's Law. The idea behind it was that the number of transistors per chip would double every year or two. And that was just a prediction. It's not a law of nature, but it's proven correct for over half a century.
At the very beginning of the chip age, Gordon Moore, who was one of the founders of Intel, was looking for a way to explain to people how chips were going to be in everything, how electronics, the whole world of electronics, was about to go through a revolution that nobody could quite understand.
By the 1960s, engineers had already designed chips with far more transistors, and each year, the number continued to grow. The first companies dedicated to making these chips were based in the U.S., where their main customer was the American government.
Point to the target and give it to the missile. Once in the air, no human hand steers Pershing. Its inertial guidance system keeps it on course to its target.
Initially, these chip companies handled the entire supply chain, designing, manufacturing, and assembling the chips for installation into various products, all within the U.S. borders. But by the late 1960s, companies began to see the potential for greater profits by designing chips for civilian products such as corporate computers. To do this, they needed to scale up production and reduce their costs. As a result, many companies moved their manufacturing and assembly to factories in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, where the labor costs were cheaper. These countries were all U.S. allies, and supporting their economies through investments also helped deepen political and economic ties. At the same time, the U.S. imposed restrictions on chip companies, prohibiting them from sharing their technology with rivals, including the Soviet Union and China, in an attempt to keep them years behind the U.S.
That's just one example of the ways that both chips and then the types of goods that chips have enabled, like phones and computers, are at the center of globalization as we know it. And that also dates back many decades, because it was the chip industry that I think pioneered the method of having offshored production and having different components and devices manufactured in multiple different countries. We take that for granted today, but that was a real innovation.
In the 1990s, Taiwan's TSMC became so skilled at chip manufacturing that many U.S. companies began outsourcing production to them.
When the company was founded in 1987, it had a really unique business model. It would only manufacture chips, not design any in-house. And that business model let it serve a wide variety of customers, companies like Apple or NVIDIA. And as a result, it's grown far larger than any other chip maker of its kind. And because of its scale, it's been able to drive down costs, but also hone its technology, because for every silicon wafer it produces, it gathers data, hones its production processes. And so it's not a coincidence that TSMC is both the world's largest chip maker, it's also the world's advanced chip maker.
But while the US and its allies were pushing the limits on chip technology, China was lagging behind. In addition to the US blocking advanced chip technology from China, many of the country's brightest minds were driven out during the rule of Mao Zedong. But over the next few decades, new Chinese leaders made efforts to catch up. By the 1990s, the Cold War had ended. The US was warming up to China, and most export controls were lifted. This change allowed China to convince many chip companies to move their assembly operations to China, and by the 2000s, the country was dominating the lower end of the semiconductor supply chain. But despite this success, China found itself in a precarious position. It was increasingly dependent on imported chips to feed its rapidly growing assembly industry. In response, the Chinese government began investing heavily in homegrown chip design and manufacturing.
In 2014, Chinese President Xi Jinping identified semiconductors as a core technology that China should produce domestically. And since that point, China has poured tens of billions of dollars a year, roughly one CHIPS Act a year, into subsidizing its own domestic production.
But despite these efforts, producing the most cutting-edge chips were still years away.
China, for a few years now, is focusing on what we call mainstream semiconductor. So semiconductor, we used to talk about IoT, all those chips that you have in all the product, making those products smarter. That's the type of chips China is basically manufacturing today. One part of the reason for that is, of course, the restriction that have been applied on EUV, as you know, which have prevented China to move to very advanced node. So the focus of China is on mainstream semiconductor.
This is one of those chips. It contains over 114 billion transistors, a massive upgrade from the 1960s chips, which only contained 4. The main problem for China is only a few companies in the world are involved in making these chips, and none are within its borders. Only 3 American companies have the software needed to design advanced chips. Then, turning those designs into real products requires a machine that is only made in one company, ASML, which is based in the Netherlands. But this machine requires equipment that is only made in the US. Finally, only companies in Taiwan and South Korea can put it all together and manufacture the most advanced chips. These companies serve as choke points in the supply chain, and China was totally reliant on them for acquiring this advanced technology.
So if you go back to the root cause, or I would say the prime motivation of export control, it was to prevent China to have access to advanced technology. EUV is not in China. By not having EUV in China, we pretty much stop the ability of China to go beyond the 5, maybe 3 nanometer node. It may be able to do a few chips, and you may see some of that in the press because of course everyone is watching very carefully. But fundamentally, by not having EUV, we have placed China, the regulation have placed China, I would say 10 to 15 years behind when it comes to advanced technology.
For years, China tried to bridge this massive gap by pouring resources into developing its own lithography machines, hoping to create something comparable to that of ASML's. But despite these efforts, China's limitations remained apparent. And so, the Chinese government took a different approach.
That according to the Bloomberg Business Week deeply researched study, 6 former and current government insiders confirmed that a tiny, like the tip of a pencil microchip was found on servers built by a Chinese-owned company that builds servers for data farms owned by Amazon, Apple, and many others, ostensibly to steal any sensitive information that may be coming through that server farm.
Throughout the 2000s, reports surfaced about Chinese hacking groups targeting companies involved in the semiconductor industry, from ASML to companies in the U.S. and Taiwan. Through these tactics, China was able to make significant strides, even managing to reverse engineer some of the most advanced chips and equipment as well. This was all happening at the same time as the relationship between the U.S. and China was becoming less friendly and more competitive.
We'll take you straight to the White House. The President of the United States announcing new trade tariffs against China. Let's listen in.
We have a tremendous intellectual property theft situation going on. China's market distortions and the way they deal cannot be tolerated.
President Trump says he will raise tariffs on Chinese goods once again. The president's move means hundreds of billions of dollars in goods that are now taxed at 10% will be raised to 25% by the end of this week.
So now it's time that we change things around. If they don't want to trade with us anymore, that would be fine with me. We'd save a lot of money.
In 2018, the Trump administration banned U.S. companies from selling components to ZTE, a Chinese tech company. Then, in 2019, the U.S. escalated further, blocking American companies from conducting business with China's largest tech company, Huawei, along with its affiliates. These bans nearly bankrupted ZTE and delivered a major blow to Huawei. In 2022, the Biden administration continued to tighten the grip.
The United States has announced further restrictions on the export of computer chip technology to China.
First, it banned all U.S. companies from selling advanced chips to China. U.S. design software and manufacturing equipment became off-limits to Chinese design companies. The U.S. also expanded restrictions to global companies that were using U.S. semiconductor technology, prohibiting them from selling advanced chips to China as well.
Just weeks before, U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese leader Xi Jinping met in Bali, where they promised to stabilize U.S.-China relations. But fierce competition on technology set to intensify, despite the handshakes and smiles. China's readout of Biden and Xi's meeting at the G20 said, starting a trade war or a technology war, pushing for decoupling and severing supply chains run counter to the principles of market economy. Such attempts serve no one's interests.
Next, the U.S. passed a law that would invest billions of dollars into its own chip manufacturing companies, finalizing a deal with Taiwan's TSMC to build manufacturing plants in the U.S.
It's crystal clear. We need these semiconductors not only for those Javelin missiles, but also for weapon systems of the future that are going to be even more reliant on advanced chips. Unfortunately, we produce 0% of these advanced chips now. And China is trying to move away ahead of us and manufacture these sophisticated chips as well. It's no wonder the Chinese Communist Party actively lobbied U.S. business against this bill. The United States must lead the world in the production of these advanced chips. This law will do exactly that.
But as the U.S. tightened its grip on the global semiconductor supply chain, China began fighting back. In early 2023, Chinese tech giant Huawei unveiled a new smartphone powered by a 7nm chip, showcasing a major leap in its semiconductor capabilities.
So Huawei quietly dropped this phone last week into the market, and it caused quite a stir. There is an advanced semiconductor inside the phone that's made by SMIC. That's a Chinese chip-making company that's not known to have these kinds of capabilities. They were able to make the phone at what's called 7nm technology, which is quite advanced. Inside of China, state media picked this up right away, and they kind of trumpeted the accomplishments. I think they're trying to show that they feel like they can make progress in technology and semiconductors in particular, even without the support of the United States or even with these U.S. sanctions.
China also escalated its geopolitical strategy by leveraging its dominance over critical rare earth minerals.
On Tuesday, China responded with export curbs of its own, announcing an immediate ban on the sales of critical minerals gallium, germanium, antimony, and superhard materials to the United States. The shipping of graphite will also be subject to stricter review. These minerals are essential for integrated circuits used in all things electronic. Beijing, though, cited national security concerns as they can have both civilian and military applications.
China has lodged stern protests with the US for its update of the semiconductor export control measures, sanctions against Chinese companies, and malicious suppression of China's technological progress. I want to reiterate that China firmly opposes the US overstretching the concept of national security, abuse of export control measures, and illegal unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction against Chinese companies.
The US quickly countered China's rare earth export ban. The Biden administration announced billions in funding for rare earth mining projects in the US, Australia, and Canada as well. By 2024, the semiconductor rivalry had reached new heights. China had just unveiled its first EUV lithography machine.
China has announced a significant advancement in its semiconductor technology with the development of a new laser-based immersion lithography machine. This new equipment achieves a resolution of 65 nanometers, a notable improvement from the previous 90 nanometers.
While not as advanced as ASML's machines, this development marked a significant milestone for China's semiconductor independence. At the same time, Huawei announced the development of a new 5nm chip, signaling that China was closing the gap with global leaders.
The Biden administration's efforts to stop China from developing its own domestic chip industry could end up backfiring, essentially, that they are going to work even harder to develop the kind of equipment that they need to make chips over the long term, and that is going to be a negative for the companies like ASML and the others that make chip-making equipment, but also for the Western chip industry more broadly.
Meanwhile, tensions are expected to escalate further with the incoming Trump administration. Trump has already made it clear that China will be a primary target of his economic agenda. On the campaign trail, he promised to impose the highest tariffs in history on China, a move that could include further restrictions on semiconductor-related exports and components as well.
As the president-elect has proposed an additional 10% tariff on China, while also threatening levies as high as 60% on all Chinese goods.
To me, the most beautiful word, and I've said this for the last couple of weeks, in the dictionary today, is the word tariff. And by the way, for years they knocked the word tariff, properly used, is a beautiful word. One of the most beautiful words I've ever heard. It's music to my ears.
Trump has also hinted at new economic incentives for US-based manufacturing, offering extended tax breaks and subsidies to lure chip makers back to American soil. If Trump follows through on his rhetoric, the semiconductor war could enter an unprecedented phase, with economic decoupling becoming the new reality.
The idea that more corporations are leaving China, what does that tell you about the state of relations between our country and China? It doesn't look that good.
Well, I think there are a number of things going on. One, China's economy is slowing, and some are simply pulling out because of that. I think also the selective technology decoupling that's going on between the U.S. and China. Companies coming under more scrutiny by the U.S. government in terms of what technology they're transferring. And as you said, China really steering domestic customers towards domestic producers of technology are also having an effect on those companies. There's still a lot of trade going on between the U.S. and China, but in the area of particularly high tech, you're seeing a selective decoupling.
But all of this has put extraordinary pressure on another conflict between two countries. Since 1949, China has viewed Taiwan as a breakaway province and vowed to reunite it, even through force.
China has again said it will, quote, reunite Taiwan with the mainland as tensions ramp up further between Beijing and the self-governing island.
解决台湾问题是中国人自己的事，要由中国人来决定。我们坚持以最大诚意，尽最大努力，争取和平统一的前景，但绝不承诺放弃使用武力，保留采取一切必要措施的选项。
Taiwan's strategic importance has never been more evident. Its semiconductor industry powers much of the global technological ecosystem, but the island is now increasingly in the crosshairs of a high-stakes geopolitical standoff.
To East Asia now, and China's latest show of force against Taiwan. It's ended a day of military drills around the self-governed island in what it says was a stern warning to Taiwan's, quote, separatist forces. Taiwanese authorities say they detected 125 Chinese aircraft, including fighter jets and drones, encircling the island.
Under the Taiwan Relations Act, America has pledged to help Taiwan maintain the military capability to defend itself from China. In recent years, U.S. arms sales to Taiwan have skyrocketed massively, and the Pentagon has increased its presence in the region. But despite the U.S.'s support, Taiwan's future remains uncertain. The possibility of a Chinese invasion has loomed large for decades, but the global technological stakes have added a new layer of urgency.
China's military says that it is ready to fight after completing 3 days of large-scale combat exercise around Taiwan.
Is Beijing, in your view, threatening Taiwan with war?
Yes, indeed. Look at the military exercises and also their rhetoric. They seem to be trying to get ready to launch a war against Taiwan.
The People's Liberation Army is working towards a critical milestone: full modernization by 2027. That year, which marks the 100th anniversary of the PLA, is also seen by some analysts as a potential flashpoint for conflict. U.S. officials, including Admiral Philip Davidson, former head of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, has warned that China might feel confident enough to attempt a full-scale invasion by 2027.
The Biden administration calls the People's Republic of China, or PRC, the only country with the will, the intent, and the military strength to change the world order.
To me, 2027 is a year that we need to watch out. If Xi Jinping cannot change the situation domestically in China, he might want to resort to a use of force or creating crisis externally to divert domestic attention or to show to the Chinese that he has accomplished something.
This timeline aligns with Xi Jinping's strategic goals of achieving complete reunification with Taiwan, a move viewed as essential to his legacy and China's rise as a global superpower. While Taiwan's semiconductor industry remains crucial, any conflict would likely trigger a supply chain crisis, unlike anything the world has ever seen. The global economy could collapse under the weight of such disruption, leading to a shift in alliances, a race to secure remaining resources, and possibly even a new world war. But the situation isn't just about military confrontation, it's also about economic leverage. China's growing technological sophistication has given it the power to disrupt global markets in ways that the US and its allies can't ignore. China is no longer just a manufacturer of goods. It's becoming a critical player in the high-tech world. In the coming years, we may see a shift toward the decoupling of the US and Chinese economies, two superpowers pulling away from each other in both trade and technology, as countries like Japan, South Korea, and European nations join the US in imposing restrictions on China. China will undoubtedly look for alternative ways of growth, possibly intensifying its pursuit of Taiwan. The next few years could be critical. The battle for semiconductors isn't just about chips, it's about who controls the future. And right now, that battle is being fought in the heart of the Taiwan Strait.